The winter of 1943 settled cold and unforgiving over Europe. In the skies above Germany, the sound of engines rolled like thunder, a low growl that carried for miles. From the ground, men and women tilted their heads upward, watching silver specks crawl across the heavens. They were American bombers, heavy with their deadly cargo, flying in tight formations that looked powerful from a distance but fragile to those who knew the truth. Because circling high above, hidden in the clouds, were the hunters of the Luftwaffe, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, swift, sharp, and deadly. To the men inside those bombers, every mission felt like a coin flipped in the hands of fate. A burning engine, a sudden explosion, a wing torn apart by cannon fire, it could all end in seconds. German generals believed this was the natural order. They trusted in their fighters, in their seasoned aces, in the fear that every American airman carried in his chest as he crossed into German skies. They believed the Reich could bleed the bomber crews faster than America could replace them. Confidence, arrogance, certainty, these were their weapons as much as bullets and shells. And then, almost without warning, something new appeared. A sleek guardian with long wings and a piercing nose, slicing through the air faster, higher, and farther than any escort before it. The P-51 Mustang. A machine that could fly with the bombers from England to Berlin and back, turning once helpless formations into fortresses guarded by speed and firepower. For the first time, the hunters looked up and realized they were no longer alone. This was not what Hitler's generals had expected. It was not what Göring had promised. The skies, once their realm, were about to slip from their grasp. And with them, the fate of the Reich itself. If stories like this capture you, if you want to understand not only the machines but the men, the choices, and the turning points that shaped the Second World War, then join us here. Subscribe to the channel, stay with us for more, and together we'll walk through the hidden battles, the forgotten heroes, and the moments when history itself seemed to hang in the balance. Because keeping these stories alive is more than remembering the past. It's giving voice to those who once looked up at the sky and wondered if they would see another dawn. In 1942, the balance of the skies over Europe was still uncertain, though to many on the ground it seemed the Luftwaffe remained untouchable. Across the continent, from the ports of France to the valleys of Austria, German fighters could appear at any moment, summoned by radar and directed by controllers who knew every inch of their airspace. It was a system the Reich had refined since the opening days of the war, and for years it had brought them victory after victory. For the Allies, this reality was cruelly apparent each time a mission was launched from Britain. Crews of the 8th Air Force gathered before dawn, their breath fogging in the cold English air, listening to briefings that promised both duty and danger. The plan always sounded clear: fly in tight formations, drop bombs with precision, and cripple the enemy's war machine. Yet the young men who walked to their aircraft knew that precision came at a cost. Without protection deep into German territory, formations would face interception again and again. The numbers spoke in whispers more chilling than any officer's orders. In the summer and autumn of 1943, raids against critical targets such as Schweinfurt and Regensburg led to staggering losses. On October 14th, later remembered as Black Thursday, out of 291 bombers that set out toward the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt, 60 were shot down and 138 more damaged. That meant nearly 1 in 5 planes did not return, and thousands of young men were lost in a single day. To those who survived, the sight of burning comrades spiraling downward through the clouds was etched into memory forever. The phrase, Schweinfurt meat grinder, passed quietly among air crews, a grim reminder that their courage was being tested against odds that seemed impossible. German generals read these results with satisfaction. Loss ratios appeared to confirm their belief that the Reich could outlast the bomber offensive. Every B-17 or B-24 that fell represented 10 men less for the Americans, and each American airman required months of training before he could take to the skies. German pilots, meanwhile, were veterans. Many had fought in Spain, Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, amassing experience that few Allied pilots could match. Ace names became legends: Erich Hartmann, who would eventually claim over 300 victories, Gerhard Barkhorn, Gunther Rall. These were hunters who treated the vast bomber formations as prey. Their confidence flowed upward to the high command, where Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring still declared with theatrical arrogance that no bomber could reach Germany's industrial heart unpunished. Yet beneath the bravado, cracks were forming. The very scale of the American bombing effort forced the Luftwaffe to respond with hundreds of sorties, day after day. Every interception consumed fuel, wore down engines, and most critically, drained the pool of experienced pilots. Even as German industry in 1943 managed to produce nearly 20,000 fighters, a figure that seemed to promise overwhelming strength, the question was not simply how many planes could be built, but how many men could be trained to fly them with skill. Training programs shortened as losses mounted, and younger, less experienced men were thrown into the fight. The Luftwaffe still had teeth, but the edge was slowly dulling. Across the Channel, American commanders debated their next move. The doctrine of daylight precision bombing depended on escort, yet no fighter then in service had the range to protect the bombers all the way to Berlin. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the British Spitfire could cover parts of the route, but both were forced to turn back long before the bombers reached their deepest targets. The solution seemed out of reach, a cruel irony when the survival of the entire air campaign depended on it. Crews joked darkly that once they crossed the Ruhr, they were on their own, lambs to the slaughter. But in the background, almost unnoticed, a new aircraft was taking shape. Born from a British request in 1940 and initially fitted with an Allison engine that limited its performance at high altitude, the early P-51 Mustang was not considered revolutionary. In fact, many dismissed it as simply adequate, another machine among many. But when engineers paired the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, an engine that thrived in the thin air above 20,000 feet, the design transformed. Suddenly the aircraft could climb, could run, and most importantly, could travel farther than any American fighter before it. Its sleek laminar flow wings cut drag and gave it speed. Its internal tanks and the addition of drop tanks extended its range far into the heart of Germany. At first, these were just technical notes on paper, little noticed outside engineering circles. But soon, test flights confirmed what numbers had promised. The Mustang could change the equation. Still, in 1942 and much of 1943, this change had not yet arrived in force. German generals, looking at bomber losses, still believed time was on their side. They calculated that if the Americans continued at this pace, morale would shatter, units would be withdrawn, and daylight bombing would be abandoned. The precedent was there. Britain had shifted to night bombing after heavy early losses, embracing area bombing as a strategy. Why would the Americans be any different? To the Luftwaffe's leaders, it was only a matter of bleeding them dry. But history rarely bends to expectations. In the late months of 1943, the first groups of P-51s began to appear in operational squadrons. At first they flew alongside P-47s and P-38s, and their numbers were small, but the difference they made was felt almost immediately. American bomber crews, accustomed to watching their escorts peel away, suddenly saw sleek fighters still beside them as they crossed deeper into Germany. For the Luftwaffe pilots, who dived toward the formations expecting easy prey, the shock was visceral. Suddenly they were not alone with the bombers. They were being hunted. To grasp the weight of this moment, one must understand the psychological battlefield as much as the physical one. For nearly 2 years, German fighter pilots had fought with a certain rhythm: intercept, attack, retreat, regroup. They had learned where to expect resistance and when the sky would open for their strikes. The arrival of the Mustang broke that rhythm. It forced them to fight on terms they had not chosen, against opponents who could chase them home. For a Luftwaffe ace used to striking and escaping, being pursued back to his own airfield was not only dangerous but humiliating. So, in those months when the Mustang first stretched its wings over Europe, the stage was being set for a transformation neither side could fully measure. On one side, German generals who still believed the Reich skies were theirs by right. On the other, American airmen who had suffered brutal losses but now glimpsed the possibility of survival, even victory. The clash was not yet decided, but the winds had shifted. The hunter and the hunted were beginning to trade places, though in Berlin few realized how quickly that shift would harden into destiny. By the winter of 1943, the rhythm of the air war over Europe had become familiar to both sides. American bombers would thunder eastward in massive formations, their wings glittering in the pale sun, and German fighters would scramble in waves to meet them. Every raid followed a pattern. The bombers endured the long flight, escorts turned back as their fuel ran low, and then, in those exposed hours, the Luftwaffe struck with ruthless precision. For American airmen this was the longest hour, the time when contrails twisted into spirals of smoke and fire. And then, almost without warning, the pattern began to crack. New aircraft appeared among the escorts, their lines unfamiliar to German eyes. At first only a handful, sleek and sharp, but they stayed with the bombers longer than any thunderbolt or lightning. They chased farther, climbed higher, and fought harder than expected. Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to turning away after a quick strike, now found themselves pursued across miles of sky. For some it was a shock, for others, a premonition. The hunters were no longer safe in their own domain. The P-51 Mustang had entered the war not with a roar but with a whisper. Its design was born almost by accident, a response to a British request for fighters early in the war. The first Mustangs carried the Allison engine, strong at low altitude but weak in the high thin air where most battles were fought. German generals barely noticed them. Yet engineers on both sides of the Atlantic saw potential in the Mustang's laminar flow wing, its sleek aerodynamics, its balance of speed and maneuverability. When the aircraft was married to the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, everything changed. Suddenly this machine could climb with the best of them, dive like a falcon, and fly farther than any escort the Americans had fielded before. Numbers told the story that pilots felt in their bones. With drop tanks attached, a P-51 could escort bombers more than 1,600 miles, enough to carry them from English bases to Berlin and back again. This was not a small improvement. It was a revolution. Until that moment, bombers had crossed into Germany knowing their escorts would vanish before the deepest targets. Now, for the first time, they could imagine steel wings beside them all the way home. German intelligence at first underestimated the significance. Reports noted a new type among American squadrons, but commanders assumed its impact would be limited. After all, the Reich was still producing fighters at an astonishing rate. In 1943 alone, German factories turned out nearly 20,000 single-engine fighters, while new airfields continued to the landscape. To generals in Berlin, the math seemed reassuring. Quantity would balance any new enemy innovation. But the truth was more complex. Planes could be built quickly, pilots could not. Every mission drained the Luftwaffe's lifeblood. Veterans who had flown since 1939 were falling faster than they could be replaced, and replacements were arriving with fewer hours of training, sometimes less than 150 before being thrown into combat. The Mustang's arrival accelerated this bleeding. Because unlike earlier escorts, which peeled away and left German fighters to regroup at leisure, the P-51 pressed the attack deep into German skies. Luftwaffe formations were hounded, chased, broken apart, and often destroyed even as they tried to disengage. One German pilot later admitted, "We no longer had the choice of when to fight. The Mustangs were there, forcing battle upon us." That shift, from hunter to hunted, was not just tactical, it was psychological. For years the Luftwaffe had dictated terms. Now it was being dragged into battles it could not avoid and often could not win. The shock of this change revealed itself most dramatically in the early raids of 1944, when Mustangs began appearing in larger numbers. On missions to Leipzig, Regensburg, and Berlin, bomber crews who had once braced for slaughter instead watched dogfights erupt around them as Mustangs tore into the German interceptors. Accounts described the sight of sleek American fighters diving through bomber formations, engines screaming, guns blazing at Messerschmitts that had once prowled unchallenged. For the first time in months, bomber crews felt not despair but hope. Yet the hope of one side was the despair of another. In Berlin, reports reached Göring that American escorts were now following bombers all the way to their targets and back. At first he dismissed them as exaggerations, the panicked words of subordinates unwilling to admit their own failures. But the truth became undeniable. Losses mounted. Pilots complained that no matter where they struck, Mustangs were there. The Reichsmarschall himself is said to have confessed privately, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." The transition was not instantaneous. Through the early months of 1944, Luftwaffe fighters still inflicted terrible damage on American raids. The skies remained a deadly place, and bomber losses were high. But the curve had bent, and momentum was shifting. What the German generals had never expected was not just a new aircraft, but a new philosophy of air war. The Mustang embodied endurance, persistence, and relentless pursuit. It did not merely defend bombers, it seized air superiority. And as the Allies learned to wield it in ever greater numbers, the shockwaves rippled far beyond the clouds. Factories in Germany that had once operated under the shield of Luftwaffe protection now found themselves vulnerable. Cities that had endured but survived Allied raids began to suffer relentless strikes. For civilians, the sight of silver bombers overhead no longer promised occasional danger but near constant threat. The air war was evolving, and with it, the very fate of the Reich. The shock of the Mustang's arrival was not limited to the frontline pilots. Deep inside Germany, the entire system that sustained the Luftwaffe began to feel the strain. Fuel depots, aircraft assembly plants, and transport hubs suddenly found themselves under increasing threat as American raids pushed deeper and deeper, now shielded by their long-range escorts. What had once been possible only on rare, high-risk missions was becoming routine. The psychological effect of this change cannot be overstated. For German workers laboring in factories, the sirens that wailed across cities no longer signaled occasional raids but a near-constant reality. For commanders in Berlin, the certainty that their air force could protect vital industries began to unravel. In early 1944, the Allies launched a campaign later known as Big Week, a coordinated series of raids designed to cripple the German aircraft industry. Between February 20th and 25th, American and British bombers struck factories producing Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, and the engines that powered them. In the past, such missions would have meant catastrophic bomber losses. But now the Mustangs flew alongside them, not turning back at the frontier but plunging straight into the heart of Germany. The results were devastating for the Luftwaffe. Over the course of those days, the Americans lost around 250 bombers, terrible but sustainable. The Germans, by contrast, lost roughly 350 to 400 fighters and, far more damaging, hundreds of their most experienced pilots. The numbers were not just statistics. They were the unraveling of an entire strategy. For years the Luftwaffe had believed attrition favored them. Yet during Big Week the tables turned. The Germans could replace aircraft quickly, but not the men. Training programs had already been shortened to meet demand, sometimes giving cadets only a fraction of the hours once required before throwing them into combat. And now those half-trained pilots faced Mustangs flown by seasoned Americans who had survived the brutal campaigns of 1943. The imbalance grew sharper with each passing month. The air battles themselves were scenes of chaos and courage. Pilots described skies so crowded with contrails, flak bursts, and twisting aircraft that it seemed the heavens themselves were unraveling. For an American fighter pilot, the mission was clear: protect the bombers at all costs. That meant diving headlong into enemy formations, trading speed and altitude for the chance to break up an attack. One Mustang pilot recalled, "You didn't think about odds. You just saw a line of Messerschmitts coming in, and you went straight at them." Such aggression stunned German pilots who had once dictated the terms of battle. But the Mustang did more than shield bombers. It gave the Allies the freedom to pursue. Before, German fighters could disengage at will, retreating beyond the range of their opponents. Now, Mustangs chased them all the way back to their airfields. Strafing runs against landing aircraft, attacks on airstrips, and relentless pursuit meant that nowhere felt safe. For the Luftwaffe, this was demoralizing in ways no statistic could capture. The home airfields, once sanctuaries, became killing grounds. Civilians noticed the change as well. Where once bomber streams had seemed distant and intermittent, the roar of Allied engines now became a daily presence. German diaries from 1944 speak of nights spent in shelters, of children waking to the thunder of bombs, of factories struck again before repairs from the last raid were complete. To them, the presence of the Mustang was invisible, but its consequences were clear. The raids that should have dwindled under Luftwaffe resistance were instead intensifying. In Berlin, Hitler's generals searched desperately for counters. They placed hope in new aircraft, particularly the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, which promised speed and power beyond anything the Allies possessed. Yet production delays, fuel shortages, and Hitler's own interference crippled the program. Other solutions were equally flawed. Increasing anti-aircraft guns strained resources already stretched thin, and diverting fuel to fighters left tanks and ground forces starved. The Reich was trapped in a vicious cycle. The more it tried to defend its skies, the weaker it became on the ground. Meanwhile, the Allies were growing stronger. American industry poured out Mustangs in ever-increasing numbers, over 15,000 by war's end. Each new squadron arriving in England meant more pressure on the Luftwaffe, more coverage for the bombers, and more losses for German pilots. The psychological shift deepened. American crews who had once whispered grim jokes about their chances now took comfort in the sight of Mustangs overhead. German pilots who had once flown with confidence now braced for ambush. The true measure of shock lay not only in the skies but in the strategic maps on commanders' desks. By mid-1944, entire swathes of German territory were within range of Allied raids that could no longer be effectively stopped. Oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, transportation hubs, targets that kept the German war machine alive, were systematically battered. Each mission eroded the Reich's capacity to fight, not just in the air but across every front. Tanks stalled without fuel, trains slowed without bearings, and soldiers at the front felt shortages that began thousands of feet above them. Through it all, the Mustang became a symbol as much as a weapon. For the Americans, it was proof that technology and persistence could overcome even the fiercest defenses. For the Germans, it was a reminder that no superiority lasted forever. The generals who had once looked skyward with assurance now found themselves calculating how much longer their forces could endure. The hunters had not just become the hunted, they were being hounded to extinction. By the spring of 1944, the change in the air war was undeniable. Reports from the front painted a picture more alarming with each passing week. Where once German fighters could mount coordinated strikes against bomber streams, now they were being intercepted before they could even form up. Airfields across western Germany and occupied France became prime targets, strafed relentlessly by roving packs of Mustangs. Fuel trucks burned on the tarmac, hangars crumbled under fire, and aircraft that had not yet left the ground were shredded by .50 caliber rounds. The very bases that were supposed to project power had become liabilities, drawing fire the moment they stirred to life. The shock within the Luftwaffe High Command was profound. Generals who had built their careers on the dominance of German air power were forced to watch as their forces dwindled. Veteran pilots spoke openly of exhaustion, of the sense that no matter how many missions they flew, the sky was no longer theirs. Göring, once flamboyant in his boasts, retreated into bitterness and anger, railing against subordinates for failures that were no longer within their control. He demanded greater sacrifices, more sorties, harsher discipline, yet the reality was that the Luftwaffe was bleeding out faster than it could be replenished. The numbers told the truth with merciless clarity. In 1944, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 28,000 aircraft in combat and accidents, while producing only 39,000 replacements. On paper this seemed sustainable, but the heart of the matter lay in the men. Experienced pilots were dying at a rate Germany could not replace, and the cadets sent in their place were often slaughtered in their first engagements. Meanwhile, American production lines not only delivered thousands of new planes but also a steady flow of trained pilots, hardened by months of instruction before facing combat. The Mustang magnified this imbalance. By extending Allied reach into the deepest parts of the Reich, it ensured that no mission was safe, no target untouchable. German commanders who once relied on staging intercepts at specific choke points found their plans unraveling under the constant pressure of escort fighters. For bomber crews, the difference was life itself. Losses that had once threatened to end the daylight bombing campaign were reduced to levels that could be endured. The long gamble of precision bombing was finally paying off. Psychologically, the Luftwaffe was caught in a trap of its own expectations. Its leaders had long believed that attrition favored them, that the Americans could not endure losses forever. Yet when the tide shifted, the realization cut deep. The Reich had gambled its air defense on a war of endurance, and now endurance belonged to the other side. Diaries of German officers from 1944 reveal a growing despair, Notes of frustration that resources were being poured into projects like the V-2 rocket or exotic jet prototypes while the skies burned above them. To them, the war was being lost not only in factories and fields, but in the arrogance of leaders who had dismissed the threat too long. For the pilots themselves, the sense of reversal was almost unbearable. Men who had once flown with pride, confident in their skill and their machines, now faced overwhelming odds every time they left the ground. One Luftwaffe veteran later recalled, "You climbed, you fought, you hoped to land alive. The sky no longer belonged to us. It belonged to the Americans." The shock of defeat was not confined to statistics. It was carved into the memories of those who survived. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, the Mustang became more than just an aircraft. It became a symbol of momentum. Crews gave their planes nicknames, painted noses with bright colors, and carried them into battle with a confidence born not of arrogance but of hard-won survival. Stories circulated of Mustangs diving through bomber formations to scatter enemy attackers, of pilots pressing pursuit until their guns ran dry, of airmen returning to base with wings riddled yet spirits unbroken. To the men in the bombers, those sleek fighters overhead were more than machines, they were lifelines. Strategically, the impact was immense. With the skies increasingly controlled by the Allies, preparations for the D-Day invasion could proceed with a confidence unthinkable a year earlier. German forces in France would face the landings with fewer supplies, weaker air cover, and a growing sense that they were being abandoned by the very air force meant to shield them. The Mustang's dominance in the spring of 1944 was thus not only a tactical victory but a prelude to the liberation of Europe. By the summer, the transformation was complete. Where once the Luftwaffe had hunted with impunity, now its remnants clung to survival. Entire groups of fighters were wiped out in a single day's battle, their losses irreplaceable. American bombers ranged deeper, hitting oil refineries that starved German tanks of fuel, striking transportation networks that crippled the movement of supplies. The Mustang was the tip of a spear that pierced the Reich's defenses, and behind it came the full weight of Allied industry and determination. For Hitler's generals, the shock was not simply that they had been beaten in the skies. It was that they had never expected it. They had believed too firmly in the invincibility of their air force, too deeply in the legend of their aces, too confidently in the fear they inspired. The arrival of the Mustang shattered that illusion, leaving them scrambling for answers as the war closed in around them. Thus, by the end of Act 2, the picture is clear. The hunters had become the hunted, the skies had changed hands, and the Reich that once dreamed of air supremacy now faced its downfall written across the heavens. The spring turned to summer, and with it came the breaking point. The Luftwaffe had once prowled Europe's skies like a predator. Now it staggered, bleeding, hunted on every front. Mustang squadrons roamed in relentless packs. They struck airfields at dawn. They cut down fighters as they climbed. They chased survivors all the way home. There was no sanctuary. The tempo of battle changed. Gone was the long duel of formations meeting in open skies. In its place came ambush, pursuit, and destruction. For German pilots, every takeoff was a gamble. Would they return? Would their comrades? Often the answer was no. Losses mounted in dizzying numbers. In May 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost more than 1,500 fighters. Training schools could not keep up. Cadets arrived at the front with barely 100 flying hours. Many died on their first mission. Some never fired a shot. The Luftwaffe was collapsing from within. The Mustang was more than a machine. It was a message. A reminder that American industry could outproduce, outtrain, and outlast. Factories across the United States poured out Mustangs by the hundreds each month. Fresh squadrons crossed the Atlantic, filled with pilots who had been prepared in safety, far from the bombs that ravaged German cities. For every Mustang lost, another seemed to appear in its place. For every German ace who fell, there was no equal replacement. The Reich's leaders scrambled for miracles. They pinned hopes on the Me-262 jet, on secret weapons, on promises that technology would turn the tide. But promises cannot fly missions. Promises cannot cover the skies. By the time jets appeared in small numbers, it was already too late. The Mustangs owned the air. And still, the raids deepened. Oil refineries at Ploiești and Luna went up in flames. Ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt were smashed again and again. Without oil, tanks sat idle. Without bearings, trains froze on their tracks. The Wehrmacht at the front felt the noose tighten. Their defeats on the ground began with thunder above. The climax came not in a single battle, but in a cascade. Big Week had broken the back of German aircraft production. The summer raids stripped away fuel. By autumn, the Luftwaffe could no longer rise in numbers large enough to matter. Mustangs flew unopposed over cities once thought untouchable. Berlin, Munich, Vienna. The Reich's heart lay bare. And with this collapse came a bitter realization among Hitler's generals. They had believed the skies were theirs. They had believed no bomber could strike the Reich without crippling losses. They had believed time favored them. Each belief shattered in turn. The words of Göring, once spoken in arrogance, returned like an echo of defeat. When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost. The climax was not just military, it was psychological. For years the Luftwaffe had been a symbol of Nazi power, the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, the terror in the skies. By 1944, it was a shadow. Its aircraft destroyed, its pilots gone, its reputation broken. The hunter had become prey, and in that transformation lay the certainty that Germany's defeat was only a matter of time. And so, as the summer of 1944 gave way to autumn, the Allies stood on the threshold of victory. The path to Normandy, to Paris, to Berlin itself, was opened not just by armies on the ground, but by the Mustangs that swept the skies clean above them. The climax of the air war had come. The Luftwaffe was finished. The Reich was exposed. And the Mustang had done what few had thought possible. It had changed the very balance of the heavens. The war in the air over Europe did not end in a single moment, nor in a single battle. It ended in a slow suffocation, a steady stripping away of Germany's power to resist. By late 1944, the skies were no longer contested. They were owned. Mustang patrols swept over Germany at will. American bombers struck with growing precision and growing confidence. German defenses fought on, brave but broken, their strength a fraction of what it once was. The transformation was complete. The consequences were immense. Without air superiority, the Wehrmacht could not maneuver freely, could not mass its forces, could not hope to resist on equal terms. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history stormed the beaches of Normandy. Behind it lay months of preparation, months of deception, months of planning. Yet what made the landing possible, what allowed Allied ships and soldiers to cross the Channel with a chance of survival, was control of the skies. The Luftwaffe, once feared as a decisive weapon, played almost no role in opposing the landings. German soldiers looked up and saw only Allied aircraft. The hunters were gone. From that moment, the collapse of the Reich accelerated. Allied bombers destroyed bridges and rail lines, crippling German logistics. Oil shortages paralyzed tanks and trucks. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was a memory, reduced to scattered flights, desperate sorties, or futile attempts by jet prototypes that came too late to matter. When Berlin finally fell, it was under skies darkened not by German bombers, but by Allied dominance. The lesson was stark. Air superiority had become not just an advantage but a necessity. The P-51 Mustang had proven that control of the air could shape the outcome of battles on the ground, the fate of armies, even the destiny of nations. German generals had never expected it. They had trusted in their numbers, their aces, their pride. And in that trust they had been undone. But history is never just about machines or strategies. It is about people. For the young men who flew the Mustangs, the war was not a grand theory. It was hours of tension, sudden bursts of violence, and the relief of survival. For bomber crews, the sight of Mustangs overhead meant hope, a lifeline where none had existed before. For German pilots, it was despair, the realization that courage alone could not overcome the tide. And for civilians on the ground, it was the sound of engines, the glow of fires, the long nights in shelters wondering when the end would come. As we look back now, the story of the Mustang is more than just the story of an aircraft. It is a reminder of how arrogance can blind, how innovation can overturn certainty, and how the fate of millions can hinge on what flies above the clouds. In the fire of war, it was a weapon. In the calm of memory, it is a lesson. And that is why we tell these stories. Because the men and women who lived them deserve to be remembered, and because the truths they reveal still matter. Technology changes. Wars change. But the human experience, the fear, the courage, the choices, remains. When we speak of the Mustang, we speak also of the danger of underestimating an enemy, the cost of pride, and the resilience of those who endure. If this journey through history has moved you, if it has given you a sense of how the skies of Europe shaped the fate of a world, then stay with us. This channel exists to keep these voices alive, to bring the hidden battles and forgotten heroes into the light once more. By subscribing, by joining us here, you ensure these stories are not lost to silence. You help carry them forward to new generations, so that the lessons of the past can guide the choices of the present. So let us close this chapter together. Picture the skies of 1945, Germany broken, the Luftwaffe shattered, the war's end in sight. And cutting through the clouds, the sleek silhouette of a P-51 Mustang, a symbol not just of victory, but of transformation. From hunter to hunted. From dominance to defeat. From arrogance to revelation. The Mustangs still fly today, preserved in museums, in air shows, in the hands of those who understand their history. Their engines still roar, not as weapons, but as echoes. Each flight is a reminder of what was won, what was lost, and what must never be forgotten. And so, as we end this story, we invite you to carry it forward. Subscribe to this channel, share it with others who care about history, and return for the next journey into the past. Because history is not distant, it is alive, if we choose to remember. And together, we will remember.